We have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hammond, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels. We are also broadcasting, as you know, simultaneously from Late Night in the Midlands, as well as Deprogram Radio Network in the United Kingdom. Today we have two guests for you. The first hour, we have, well, I'm going to leave you for a second as I introduce him, but hour two, Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai, who is running for United States Senate to unseat Pocahontas, who is affectionately called Pocahontas. Basically, she is Elizabeth Senator Warren. You'd have to be living under a rock. And just before we came on the show, okay, as I was saying, folks, again, this is a double show today. Hour two, I'm going to talk about our hour one guest in a quick minute. Hour two, we have coming back Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai, who is running against U.S. Senate candidate Miss Elizabeth Warren, better known as Pocahontas. And of course, he is another shock candidate. That seems to be the new thing. And as you know from our promotion lately, today we have one and only Mr. Roger Stone. He's got a lot of titles, so let me read them to you, or basically I know them off the top of my head. He is an agent provocateur, a raconteur, which is something I've always called myself, so now he's got that title. I guess, well, he deserves it more than I do, I guess, at this point. New York Times best-selling author, as our guest is also tomorrow night. Star of the Netflix film Get Me, Roger Stone, something I was always telling my producers going back to the summer of 2015 with Governor Jesse Ventura. And, of course, I want to say the advisor to President Donald J. Trump. Now, some people also call him dirty trickster. I have a better title for him than that. I say he's the coolest cat who's ever walked this earth. So, without further ado, Mr. Stone, welcome to the show.
I'll take the new title. Coolest cat. Done.
Yes. Exactly. I would hope you would. And you know what? I have to agree with one of the Stones rules of it is better to be infamous than never be famous at all. Because when I started throwing raves back in 1997, when I was, barely an adult, at the time, I used to always say it's better to have no publicity, bad publicity than no publicity at all. But with you, I think the Stones rule for you should be, you've already got you already have the famous part. The infamy, you could talk about that from the past at this point. So anyway, as you know, Stone's rules number 20 is use a cigar. I'm a big cigar smoker, and for this occasion, I have pulled out the Opus X from the humidor. So here's my first question to you. I'd like to take you back to your childhood, and this is one of the funniest things that my friend Chris, who loves to watch Get Me, Roger Stone, always brings up and wanted me to ask you this, and would probably kill me as he's listening to me right now if I didn't ask this first. Can you talk about that mock school election you had at the time when Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Nixon were running for the office of the presidency?
Sure. I was living in a suburban community outside of New York City, a fairly Republican suburb, and I wasn't really politically aware yet, and therefore, as a kid, I favored the candidacy of John F. Kennedy over the candidacy of Richard Nixon, largely because I thought John Kennedy had much better hair. And we were having a mock election in the first grade at the elementary school where I went to school, and I decided to try to affect the outcome of that election for my candidate, JFK. So I waited in the cafeteria line, and as each kid got their lunch, I told them, if Nixon is elected, we're going to have school on Saturdays. Well, that piece of disinformation worked fairly well because that evening, or the next morning, I guess it was, when the mock election was held in this fairly Republican area, to everyone's surprise, John Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon in the first grade.
Now, let me ask you this.
Of course, that's the last time I ever used disinformation in that way.
Let's leave that at that, right? That's the best way to say it. But let me ask you this. Was that mock election a landslide?
No, I don't think it was overwhelming, but it worked because given where we lived and the fact that at that juncture most kids would reflect the views of their parents, we were in an area that probably voted 70% for Nixon over Kennedy. Now, in my own case, because I'm a Roman Catholic, my parents were practicing Catholics, my grandparents were practicing Catholics, I am a practicing Catholic, we were torn. My parents were Republicans, but I do know that they were very attracted to John Kennedy and the idea that he would be our first Catholic president. So, for all I know, they may have voted for him unbeknownst to me.
Now, I'm going to come back to that hair issue in a little bit because it actually applies now. But talking about Mr. Nixon, something happened in '72, which was a rather important thing. I mean, you were the absolute youngest person on the committee to reelect Richard Nixon. How did that happen?
Well, I was in college at George Washington University, and I invited Jeb Stuart Magruder, who was then the executive director, I think he was the acting chairman of the committee to reelect the president, to speak at my college. And when he came to speak, I buttonholed him for a job. And I must have impressed him because he told me he would have somebody call me. And then I subsequently got a call from a gentleman named Bart Porter, who called me in for an interview. And they asked me what I could do, and I said I could do anything. And they specifically said, well, we have a job available as a scheduler for the Nixon daughters, Julia and Tricia Nixon, someone who would keep their campaign schedule. And they wondered whether I could do that job, and I was sure that I could. The most telling thing was, and this is euphemistic, but the budgeted amount for this scheduling slot was, let's call it $25,000 a year, and I was willing to do it for $18,000. Well, that meant that Porter could go to his boss and say, look, boss, I got a substantial net savings with this hire, and therefore I was hired.
Now, this was obviously a pivotal thing because, you're one of the youngest people working in the Oval at that point, and that only lasted for 2 years. And, of course, Watergate. The Watergate scandal was, some people call it scandal, some people call it a very sad point because Richard Nixon is highly regarded amongst Republicans. Now, living in California, I'm stuck in Liberal City, but I've always said growing up, I am so far right that Republicans call me left. You say you have a libertarian streak to you, I just say it's called getting with the times. So I guess you could say I am the libertarian streak and the further than the old right. Now, here it's kind of hard to find people like that, so that's the biggest problem. But of course, we have a lot of the Republican voters throughout the Midwest and the South, and basically even in California, as long as they're not on the Pacific Coast. But you were able to, after you were involved with we don't have to spend much time on the Watergate committee, but your name was shown on that board, which was probably pretty cool. And as you've actually mentioned, is that your parents were sort of mortified, but you thought it was pretty cool. I'd think it's pretty cool too. But my next thing I wanted to speak about is you literally became friends with Mr. Richard Nixon, who at that point was former president, and you started working for the next presidential candidate, Ronald Reagan. How did that come about, where you went from Nixon and was able to literally connect with Reagan?
Well, let's take this in pieces. First of all, I think it is a great tragedy that the accomplishments of President Nixon get buried in Watergate.
Yes.
Nixon reached a strategic arms limitation with the Russians. He ended the war in Vietnam on a much faster timetable than the Pentagon favored. He opened the door to China and negotiated a peaceful existence with them. He unilaterally saved the state of Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when the Israelis' backs were against the sea and they were under attack from the Syrians and the Egyptians. He desegregated the public schools. He gave us affirmative action in the hiring of African Americans. He desegregated the trade unions. He launched the government's war on cancer. He gave us federal revenue sharing. He formed the Environmental Protection Agency. Up until that time, we had no formal Environmental Protection Agency function. So he was a very successful, and you could even argue progressive president. Compare that to some of our more recent presidents. It's a solid bank of accomplishments. But all of that gets erased, unfortunately, in the ashes of Watergate. Because Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan both came from Southern California, they shared many of the same key contributors, many of the same personal friends, and it was former President Nixon who introduced me to Governor Ronald Reagan, and I was hired to work on Governor Reagan's 1976 campaign when we sought to wrest the nomination from Gerald Ford, who had been appointed vice president and then risen to the presidency upon Nixon's resignation, and then worked again for Governor Reagan when he was successfully elected in 1980, then brought back a third time to work for President Reagan's re-election in 1984. So I was introduced to the Reagans by President Nixon, who gave me a strong recommendation, and I ended up handling political affairs in the northeastern United States for President Reagan.
When you mentioned all the accomplishments with Nixon, and I was talking about the fact that there are so few Republicans to talk about, what I was trying to say about the tragedy of the Watergate, I mean that by the liberals literally using that and taking away all his accomplishments, because the few Republicans around here that I'm able to converse with, they actually still talk about Nixon. If he was able to finish his term, would have gone down hands down as one of the greatest presidents of all time. So I totally agree with you. There are a lot of accomplishments this man did.
And the true story of Watergate has not yet been written. As I wrote in my book, Nixon's Secrets, and in my second book, Tricky Dick, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Richard Nixon, we now know a lot of things today we didn't know then. Of the 6 Watergate burglars, 3 of them were still in the employ of the Central Intelligence Agency and were reporting to their case officers. We also know that according to Tony Ulasewicz and Jack Caulfield, 2 decorated New York police officers who were working as private investigators for the Office of the White House Counsel, John Dean sent both men into the Watergate complex 6 weeks before the break-in to case the place out and provide him with a floor plan. That means John Dean was well aware of, in fact, he's the guy who conceived of, pushed, and then lied about the Watergate break-in for almost 9 months. The real perp in Watergate is John W. Dean. Mr. Dean, if you're listening, please sue me. Sue me as soon as you can. My lawyers can't wait to have you under oath, because you lied to the Senate Watergate Committee under oath. You lied to the Watergate Special Prosecutors under oath. We have a document between the two that outlines your perjury, and I want to ask you about it.
Now, John Dean was literally the entire reason everything happened. It was him just turning state's evidence and what we call singing. But unfortunately, the sad part is that Nixon had won the 72 campaign in a landslide. Nothing that these clowns in America, CIA, agents that were part of the burglars, the plumbers, literally. They didn't really have an impact on the election of 72. I mean, this is something that no one can deny.
It took a year for Watergate to impact on the American people. But Let's compare that with the scandal we have going on today. The Obama administration and the Obama FBI used a fraudulent FISA warrant to justify the state spying on the Trump campaign. That's an abuse of power in which the authority and capability of the state was used not for national security purposes, but for strictly political purposes. That's why they do not want to hand over the unredacted FISA information to the Congress. That is what they are hiding. A scandal far worse than Watergate. In Watergate, a small group of misguided individuals who were private citizens, although 3 of them were secretly on the payroll of the CIA having infiltrated the Watergate burglar team, broke into the Watergate and placed bugs, which, by the way, never worked. Compare
Agreed.
that to the abuse of power we have just seen under Barack Obama, which is, in my opinion, a far, far bigger scandal.
You know what? You actually opened the door to something that I was absolutely going to talk about, because as this has been happening for, we're literally this is 2+ years going on from the moment that Fusion GPS was hired by Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Barack Obama, Bill and Hillary Clinton, and of course given with the blessing to James Comey, John Brennan, Andrew McCabe, the entire list of the corruptibles, Christopher Steele, and I'm sure you even know about this, but Mr. Brennan's CIA Project Umbra uses digital fingerprints of over 500 nations and their respective intelligence agencies to frame Russia. So the collusion was not between the U.S. and Russia meddling with the elections. It was the U.S. and the United Kingdom. I would think you would agree with that, wouldn't you?
Yes, which is why the British government has formally objected to President Trump declassifying the information pertaining to these FISA warrants, not as a matter of national security, because it will establish that the British were spying on the Trump campaign at the behest of the British. By the way, this is a very old trick. Since it's illegal for U.S. intelligence to spy on Trump, you ask the Brits to do it. J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI asked the British Secret Service, the British intelligence agency, to spy on former Vice President Richard Nixon when he was visiting Hong Kong, because Nixon was entertaining an extraordinarily attractive Chinese woman in his hotel room who the FBI thought was a Chinese spy. This is detailed in my book, Nixon's Secrets. So this is a common occurrence. It gives the U.S. intelligence deniability, and of course it's not illegal for the Brits to conduct surveillance in the United States, as it would be for the English.
And now they're literally caught with their pants down, because there's so many pieces of evidence that could link this. I'm talking about texts, emails. I mean, just look at Lisa Page and Peter Strzok's texts to each other. I mean, it's like they were doing this in so much openness that they didn't even care if they were going to get caught, because they were so sure crooked Hillary would take the helm, and of course probably give them fat checks cut by the Treasury, right?
Well, I think they were confident that they could engage in their plot using government texts and government emails, because Hillary would be elected and that there would be no way that those documents would ever become publicly released. And of course they turn out to be wrong about that, but the Trump Justice Department under Rod Rosenstein, or is it Rattenstein, or Rod Rattenstein, or Rat Rosen? I can't ever quite get it straight.
I just call him
that
Rat.
Little weasel. Have done everything humanly possible to keep this information from the American people. The Congress is a co-equal branch of government. They're entitled to this information, and they have an oversight authority over the Justice Department. Yet he is stonewalled handing over the information regarding this surveillance. And that's the Rosetta Stone of this whole scandal. Now, Peter Strzok, the rogue FBI agent who was running the operation, says in a text that Barack Obama wants to know everything. That tells me this operation goes all the way to the top. Or if I may use a phrase from Watergate, what did Obama know and when did he know it? See, no person is above the law, not even Barack Obama. I think he should face justice if it is proven that he approved of the operation to use fake FISA warrants to spy on Donald Trump. Barry's got to do some time in a federal penitentiary if that is the case. I think at the end of the day, we're going to find out how much he knew and when he knew it.
Well, I think if James Comey and, of course, all the other people in the Federal Bureau of Investigation and clowns in America, Mr. Brennan and all his people, I don't think they'd be cocky enough to act without Barry Hussein telling them, hey, here's my blessing. Go make sure crooked Hillary gets in. So I would think that, there is links. And like you said, no one is above the law. A lot of people constantly ask me, are these people going to get locked up? I truly think so. Wouldn't you think that justice will come down before Trump finishes office? And I pretty confident. I run the Zip Poll app all the time for asking people about guests on the show. And of course, I constantly run it about specific states and about will be there a red wave, Democrats only, will there be a blue wave? To pretty much 95% of what I'm getting is that there is absolutely going to be no blue wave and a red wave. So if that's any indication of what's going to happen in a little over 2 years with Mr. Trump's 2020 election, I think he will be an 8-year president. So personally, I would say maybe in the second term, the indictment's going to come down and all the arrests. But I believe they're going to happen. What say you?
Well, first of all, I'm really not clear. There really does seem to be two systems of justice. The special counsel, Robert Mueller, seems to have no interest in the fact, for example, that Bill and Hillary Clinton took $145 million from the Russian energy company at the precise time that a contract that gave control of 20% of America's enriched uranium was on her desk for approval in a sale to the Russian company. That seems to me to be an open and shut case, but doesn't seem to interest Robert Mueller. We now know for a certainty that Barack Obama was supplying guns to ISIS. That's crime, but he doesn't seem to be too interested in that crime. No, it seems that the Trump Justice Department and their special counsel are only interested in the alleged or potential crimes of Donald Trump and his supporters, yet Bill and Hillary run a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise called the Clinton Foundation. By the way, they paid for Chelsea's $6 million wedding out of that. I wonder if they declared that on their taxes.
Probably
not.
They
didn't.
Yeah.
And nothing happens. No, there are two standards of justice, which is why this country is beginning to come apart at the seams. At a certain point, if the American people begin to believe that they cannot get justice from the government, then they will seek justice in their own hands. That will be very sad.
Very much agreed. And I'm going to comment on that briefly, but you brought up another name that I was going to bring up. The next annoying person under Rat Weaselstein is Robert Mueller. I mean, he's so dirty, he goes back to 9/11 dirty. I mean, what is he doing? I mean, he subpoenaing you and Jerome Corsi and Kristen Davis. What the hell is going on?
He is the hitman for the deep state. Look, Robert Mueller is the man who covered up Saudi involvement in 9/11. There are multiple complaints from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement about 5 men who are training at a flight school in Sarasota, Florida, who turn out to be among the hijackers of 9/11. Mueller does nothing, no investigation. Then after the fact, he investigates and he finds the local home where a Saudi couple has been harboring these 5 men. The Saudi family that owns the home are long gone. Then he signs a report, which can be found online, was obtained by Judicial Watch through a Freedom of Information Act, claiming that this Saudi family had no connections to the 9/11 plot, except for they did. It doesn't matter whether it's 9/11 or if it's a Pan Am 103 and the Lockerbie disaster, or whether it's BCCI, or whether it's the fact that Robert Mueller let 4 men rot in a Boston jail for a murder he knew they didn't commit in order to cover up mob FBI informants. The man has been the cover-up artist for the deep state. And for the New York Times to run a front-page profile claiming that he's akin to St. Thomas Aquinas is just fake news gone crazy. It is, without any question, I'm being subject to an inquisition in which at least 12 of my current or former associates have been questioned by the FBI. At least 8 of my current or former associates have been dragged before the grand jury. And they ask questions about my family life, my personal life,
That's
my
pathetic.
social life, my business life, my political life, my sex life.
Jeez.
What does that have to do with Russian collusion?
Absolutely
Why are any of
nothing.
these matters pertain to Russian collusion? There is no evidence of Russian collusion on my part. There is no evidence of collaboration with WikiLeaks other than the fact that I'm able to follow very closely online what they're doing and reflect it in my Twitter feed, which drives them crazy. But I have no advance notice of the WikiLeaks disclosures regarding the DNC. The whole question of where that information come from is meant to distract from the content. The content showed that Hillary Clinton herself was directing dirty tricks. That's what they brought Nixon down for. The Obama FBI has infiltrated Trump's campaign in their entree to Papadopoulos, in their entree to Carter Page, in the informant they sent to me in May 2016. That's against the law. That's what Nixon went down for, infiltrating his opponent's campaign. So you have to wonder whether justice will ever really be done. In my own personal case, this threatens to bankrupt me. My legal bills have topped $500,000. I've been sued in a defamation lawsuit. I won that suit. I've been sued by a D.C.-based Obama group that alleged that the Russians hacked the DNC, gave the material to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks gave it to me. That's a fairy tale. That lawsuit was dismissed. That cost me $250,000. I'm now being sued by the Democratic National Committee, which is excellent because my lawyers demand to see their computer servers,
Yes.
and we'll find out once and for all whether they were really hacked. Oh, whoops. The servers were bleached. They were destroyed. They no longer exist. Wow, what does that indicate? Meanwhile, I have the Senate Intelligence Committee, who literally is asking for over 1 million documents from me. 1 million, enough to fill 4 trailer trucks of paper, and would like an open-ended, interrogation under oath. And I have Robert Mueller poking into every molecule of my life. How's his relationship with his wife? How does he get along with his children? Does he drink a lot? How about marijuana? Does he smoke marijuana? Do you think he has a girlfriend? Do you think he has a boyfriend? Who are his clients? Where's his money come from? What does he do on Saturdays? What does any of this have to do with Russian collusion?
Does he screw with his black socks on and hookers? You're absolutely right. What the hell?
No, you're confusing me with Elliot Spitzer. I would never do it with my socks on.
I was making the joke of Mueller. The point I'm trying to say is, first of all, let me apologize to you and say I'm deeply sorry for Mr. Manafort. I do know that you were associates with him, with Black Manafort and Stone, and I can tell you this as someone involved with criminal law before I got into journalism. Anybody with several $1 million is going to have offshore accounts. Are you telling me Mr. Clean Mueller with $17.1 million or whatever he has at this point doesn't have any offshore accounts with some money?
Well, in fact, we ought to look at how much he and Comey have made over their cover-up in the HSFB matter. They've got more criminal fraud problems than Paul Manafort ever had. But let me say this. The crimes for which Manafort was recently convicted were alleged 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, the Justice Department determined that there was not enough evidence to bring him to trial. Why did they revive those charges now? By the way, the assistant U.S. attorney who decided not to prosecute back then, 10 years ago, was a guy named Rod Rosenstein.
Wow.
Now,
and yet
at trial, the government insisted, and they insist the same thing in discovery in the D.C. trial that has now been called off, that Manafort was never under surveillance. Never. That's a lie. I've been under surveillance since May of 2016. Dr. J, think about that for a moment. Someone has had access to all my emails, all my text messages, all my phone calls from May 2016 to this very radio show. If that's not a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights, what is? What would be the probable cause? Oh, you were in touch with Julian Assange? No, I wasn't. Prove it. Show me where I was ever in touch with Julian Assange. In fact, show me where I had any foreign phone calls or emails at all, period, ad nauseum. They had no probable cause. You know what their probable cause was?
Nothing.
I was supporting Donald Trump for president. That's what.
Yeah, but see, there's good probable cause, there's bad probable cause. This is like zero probable cause because you were essentially helping him, during his campaign. You supported him openly. You were giving interviews, of course, encouraging people to vote. I mean, I was doing the same thing. So all of a sudden, what should I be worrying that Mr. Mueller is probably going to start investigating me in association to you? I don't know, because I'm so twisted. I used to believe in justice. I mean, going into law school and afterwards. But now my biggest question is if Mr. Rat Weaseltine, if he did not charge Manafort 10 years ago, then why did he sick his dog Mueller now? And obviously the biggest question is who is going to turn around and look at Mueller and file some charges against him?
Well, it's an interesting question. Tomorrow's meeting between the president and Rosenstein will tell us a great deal. There are three outcomes. Rosenstein can resign. That means perhaps Mueller will finally have some reasonable oversight. Rosenstein could be fired, in which case Mr. Mueller may have some reasonable oversight, or Mr. Rosenstein will stay, in which case, I'm saying it right here on the Dr. J show, Donald Trump will not fill out the balance of his term. He will be removed.
I truly hope not. And one thing that's always annoyed me is Jeff Sessions recused himself. Okay, if he saw a conflict, and why didn't he get rid of, Rosenstein before, or like I said, Rat Weaselstein? Because he could have literally cleaned house, in the Justice Department, and therefore, if Jeff Sessions recused himself, there could have been somebody on Trump's side doing their job, and this Russia collusion witch hunt would have never come about.
Why did he hire Rosenstein to begin with? Rosenstein was recommended by Reince Priebus, the former Republican national chairman, who did everything within his power to stop Donald Trump from being elected president. Why would Donald Trump appoint such a man to be his first White House chief of staff? He's not only an incompetent, but he gave us Rod Rosenstein. Why does the president hire General Kelly? Why has he hired any of the people on his White House staff? There is not a single member of the White House staff, other than Kellyanne Conway and Larry Kudlow, who voted for Donald Trump. Every single other member of the White House staff voted for Hillary Clinton. That is a sad fact.
Now, you've been involved, and that was when I was going to save that hair comment earlier about JFK having gray hair, because you also, mentioned that and get me Roger Stone about Donald Trump. If you were involved in trying to get him into the White House from the time he'd been flirting with the presidency since '88, I believe, again, it was '98 when he met with Jesse Ventura, and you came along for that visit. And
yes.
Yeah, and then, of course, when the Pat Buchanan and the reform deal, but he seemed to listen to you, and I don't think he would have ran for president. Again, I don't know your dynamics between you, but from everything I paid attention to, I believe you probably gave him that extra push of confidence, say, hey, you could run and you're going to win. Why didn't he listen to you when staffing his White House?
Well, it's an excellent question, but it's one that you would have to ask him. I have been entirely loyal to the president. When I spoke in Palm Beach a week ago, I said that there were no circumstances, even if I were indicted in some trumped-up charge by Robert Mueller, that I would roll on the president. I need to clarify that because people immediately said, well, that means you have something to roll on him about. No, what I'm saying is that there is no amount of pressure that they can apply that would get me to make stuff up and bear false witness against the president. I'm not going to do that. That's how this works. You find an underling, you find something they've done wrong, and then you squeeze them to lie and make accusations against a bigger fish. The young people that are working for me that have been dragged before the grand jury are in this exact position. Let's just say that a guy who worked for me, hypothetically, didn't pay his taxes for 3 years. Fine. We're going to send you to jail for tax evasion unless you tell us that you walked into Stone's apartment and there were 4 Russians meeting in the living room. Of course, that never happened.
I wanted to ask Miss Kristen Davis this when I was booking you before she sent me off to Laney, but obviously I didn't, so maybe I could ask you, was the only reason she was brought before Mueller and the grand jury because she has an association with you?
There's no question. We are very close friends. We share. I live in Florida, but I have a small apartment. It's a 2-story affair, like a duplex, where she and her infant son live downstairs, and I live upstairs. I'm not there very often. But why would FBI agents go to all of my friends with a picture of her adorable baby and say, is Roger Stone the father of this baby?
Jeez, wow.
Is Roger Stone Kristen Davis Roger Stone's baby mama? By the way, I'm not. I am the godfather to Carter Stone Davis, who you can see on Twitter, Carter Stone Davis. He's there on Twitter. He's the most gorgeous, smartest young man I've ever met. And if I live long enough, I am going to make him president. But I'm not his daddy. But
now,
why would Robert Mueller be asking people that? What does that have to do with Russian collusion?
Nothing has to do with Russian collusion, but I may have an inkling of an answer that I think is going to be a topic that we definitely need to discuss. And that is fake news, the propaganda, the Clinton News Network, which I think is the communist news network, and the rise of the Nazi Party in America. When I say Nazi Party, I'm talking about National Socialism. Well, why do I say National Socialism? Because we now have a National Socialism in this country. It's called the Democratic Socialists of America. I mean, don't people remember what happened in the late 30s through the early 40s?
Well, unfortunately, they don't. But you see right now in Venezuela how successful socialism is. People are eating grass. There are no dogs because the dogs have been killed to be eaten. 5 million people have fled the country. The Colombians have had to erect a fence along their border to repel refugees. It's a tragic, tragic story. But that is what happens.
There is no media, literally no media that I can see that is not full of propaganda. The closest mainstream media I would have to say is probably close to accurate is One American News. But honestly, I have to read your articles, Jerome Corsi's, InfoWars, and what I say on the show. That's pretty much it. I mean, I know a handful of good journalists, many on this network, of course, but what happened to journalism in America? This has turned into one giant propaganda machine for the Nazi Party. And they really think we're stupid. There is a video I posted on YouTube of the top 10 staged media events, and they're pretty deplorable. They must really think humanity is stupid. But then again, this begs the question, are Americans that stupid that they literally believe everything they see on ABC, CNN, and MSNBC and not second guess it twice? Like, for instance, this accuser of Brett Kavanaugh who donated to Hillary 16 times and has a foggy memory and refuses to testify.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary because this sets a new standard. It's actually hard for me to believe. The standard in American journalism has always been that you needed 2 sources to confirm that something happened, 2 completely independent sources. Now, a woman can come forward and say she was sexually assaulted by Brett Kavanaugh. She doesn't need to have any witnesses, any corroboration, any proof whatsoever, but we're told we must believe her simply because she's a woman. The world has gone mad. Now, but let me tell you the logical succession of this. A woman's going to come forward, I predict, in the next 24 hours. She's going to say she was sexually assaulted by Cory Booker. She doesn't remember when it was. She doesn't remember where it was. She doesn't remember what year it was. And she only recently remembered it. But none of that matters because she said it happened. She has no witnesses. She has no corroboration. But she must be believed. Cory Booker has to resign. End of story. He must resign. There's no back talk. There's no discussion. She said it happened. Therefore, he must resign. When is the senator from New Jersey? When is Spartacus, better known as Jerkophicus? When is he resigning?
That's the key question, because I would hate to see him, obviously I don't think he'd win in 2020 unless Mr. Mueller really screws things up with Rosenstein, of course, or like I said, Mr. Rat Weaselstein. But the question is will this really happen? Because you have these crazy, deranged socialist Democrats doing everything. So even if they have an accuser, just like they seem to be very persuasive in bringing against the Republicans, I have a feeling that the Democrats will rally behind her and make sure Mr. Booker is fine-free.
If Cory Booker's IQ was 1 point lower, you'd have to water him like a plant.
It has to be pretty darn low. I mean, I didn't know special education children ever made it into, the
as
House
the mayor
or
of
Senate.
Newark, he stole $600,000 from the city water authority and laundered it through his law firm and put it in his pocket. If he were a white Republican, he'd still be in prison. But there are different rules for Democrats. This man is a blight upon the earth. He has an IQ that may hit 70. He never follows through on anything. He's the king of the press release. That's about it. And then you have Richard Blumenthal, a man who lied about serving in Vietnam, who never set foot in Vietnam, calling Brett Kavanaugh a liar. No citizen should allow this man to speak. Richard Blumenthal should be shouted down any place he appears in public. He's soiled the office of the U.S. Senate, and he has soiled the memory of the good men and women who did die in Vietnam. This man is walking scum. Walking scum.
I honestly would have to say that walking scum exists with probably the entire left at this point, especially those, they call them the progressives, like Miss Pocahontas or Ocasio-Cortez, who refuses to debate any man because it's so-called a catcall, or any Republican female because she's a female and possibly a lesbian and is also hitting on her, but she can't seem to explain where we're going to get all this free stuff, free Medicare for all, free money, free housing. Where do these people, I don't understand. When I went to college, I received an education. We were taught to debate. We were taught to look things through and think for yourself. Where the hell is someone like this coming out with this? And yet, that same day she's elected, searches for socialism goes up 1,500%. And I believe the last count of the socialist Democrat parties that literally started in all the schools is up about 700+% at this point. Why are people or children, I really fear for the children of the future, how can they be so brainwashed that they could think that I'm going to go get some higher education? Oh, I'm introduced to socialism. Oh, this sounds pretty good. Free money. I don't have to work. Free health care. But where the hell's the money going to come from?
Well, but that explains the entire candidacy of Bernie Sanders. People voting for free stuff. This is not new in our American politics. People want a balanced budget, yet they want more spent on education, for example. So they really don't want a balanced budget. They just think they do. It's an anomaly. But people, unfortunately, those who don't think that the government can give you something for free and don't realize that ultimately you pay for it, through higher taxes and other fees.
A recent breakdown to try to implement this, just the Medicare for all, by the way, not anything else they're talking about, would literally take more than 100% tax rate and taking everybody's lifetime savings, and you probably still wouldn't have the 40 plus trillion dollars to implement this deal for 1 year, by the way, 1 year. So what people are just going to start working, and here you go, here's the paycheck, I'm just not going to eat anymore. Yeah, you can have my house, I can't afford the mortgage payment. Well, you guys get this worked out, this whole socialism thing, we're all going to become derelicts on the street. I mean, that's what it sounds like the game plan is to me.
I couldn't disagree. I could not agree more.
Now, you've stated that you've never run for office and you don't want to run for office. And I honestly don't blame you. I mean, things are pretty much so bad. I really got to feel for Trump. He's got to have some seriously thick skin for what everybody is saying about this poor guy every single day. Every time he does something right, it is spun so far out of control from the left that they make it seem like he's just doing everything wrong. Yet, like Mr. Obama couldn't have done anything wrong because he was the greatest president who ever lived, just like they say with Clinton, right? But yet, Donald Trump can't do anything right, even though GDP is great, unemployment's low. So here's a hypothetical for you. Assuming you didn't have that beliefs of you would never run, if you were president, what would you do differently?
Well, I think the president's done a great job in the domestic realm. We have 4.6% economic growth, almost 5%. I predict it'll hit 6% in the next quarter. He's created 3.2 million new jobs. Wages are growing at the fastest rate in American history. Unemployment is at the lowest point in our history. Black and Hispanic unemployment are at the lowest point in their history since we began keeping those statistics. We have a record stock market. There are billions of dollars coming back into the country to be invested here. Where I do think he could do a better job is to withdraw our troops from Syria, withdraw from Afghanistan. We do not need to be engaged in foreign wars where our inherent national interests are just not clear. I think the neocons who still infect the Defense Department and our intelligence agencies have misled him. I do not believe Assad has ever gassed his own people. He's not that stupid. He's winning the civil war there. He signed an agreement with the Soviets, certified by Secretary of State John Kerry, that says he has no chemical weapons. Why would he gas his own people, knowing that it would turn the entire world community against him, unless it is a false flag operation run by U.S. intelligence using proxies for these attacks in order to justify our continued presence in Syria? Funny how the last gas attack happened only days after Donald Trump said on his Twitter feed that it was time to get out of Syria. How coincidental.
You know, the sad thing is just recently, and again, this just goes to show that a lot of people aren't watching any of the right media. What are your comments about One America News Network, by the way? Because like I said, I do believe
I love One America. I've been on with Jack Posobiec. I've been on with Trey Yingst. I've been on with Chris Carter. I've been on with Emerald. I'm a regular there. I think they do a superb job. Far superior than, say, CNN. Yeah. I don't get my news from the CNN for the same reason I don't eat out of the toilet.
Thank you. Okay, so we do have the same beliefs. When I said there's nothing on the mainstream media that I can trust except for One America News, that we're on the same level there.
Well, I obviously am very partial to InfoWars. I get a lot of information there. I do a show on InfoWars, The War Room, every day at 5. But by the same token, you have, for example, MSNBC. Have you ever seen this guy, Ari Melber? This guy's a lowlife. I mean, he's a cretin. Pretending to be a journalist, but a rabid partisan. He drools in his hatred of Donald Trump. He's literally drooling. He drools when my name comes up. He's a sick human being. He has no public credibility. The good news is nobody's watching. But he fancies himself a journalist. In fact, he's just an a-hole.
When you asked me if I knew who he was, and I said no, and you just followed up with nobody watches, that is exactly why I don't know. Just like you said, you don't watch CNN for the same reason you don't eat or drink out of the toilet. Well, I have not watched MSNBC. I did used to watch Fox until I found One American News, and when I started to compare, I started to throw Fox in that little same shill factory. But the reason I brought up One American News again right after you brought up the Syria, this false flag, is because they did a little piece on that there were no chemical weapons, that interviews with people on the ground, the civilians who were supposedly killed in that area from these chemical weapons, said there was no chemical attack, there was no one harmed, and definitely no one died from chemical weapons. So I think, like you said, it is a false flag. And if it happened, literally days after President Trump said he was going to get out of Syria. Well, what a convenient way. And this sadly goes to one of the very first things I learned in college before I went off to university. I studied economics, and one of the first things we learned on the first day in macroeconomics, the professor said, does everyone know how to fix an economy? Of course, everybody had their own different view, and she said, you're all wrong. Start a war was her answer. And we're like bewildered, start a war. And of course, my wheels are turning, and I'm thinking, okay, you got money for munitions and, everything from shoelaces to toothpaste to the Coca-Cola. Okay, I get that part. But she said, we're not only going to bomb the heck out of the country, then we're going to go back and rebuild it. So the reason I think these people are involved in these wars with other countries that we definitely don't need to be involved in is unfortunately because they can't seem to figure out another way to make money other than running drugs and guns.
I agree.
Yeah, again, it's very sad. Now, we are coming very close to the bottom of the hour. And like I said, there was just so much more stuff to ask of the coolest cat who's walked this earth. So let's talk about Stone's rules real quick. Unfortunately, I just recently got my review copy, and I am only gotten into rule number 20, use a cigar, and I always use a cigar. Let's talk about that book because, like you say, How to Win at Politics, Business, and Style, I just want to say it's a how-to-win book at everything because these rules are pretty darn cool. What inspired you to write?
This is different than any book that I've written previously because it doesn't really matter what your politics are. This book would be as useful for a Bernie Sanders progressive as it would be for a conservative Republican Trump supporter, as it would be for somebody who's totally non-political and not interested in politics. These are the rules of life, the things that I have learned in a 40-year career in the American arena, and it covers everything. It covers how to dress, how to eat, how to make a proper martini, how to budget a digital public relations campaign, some of the elementary rules of advertising. These are really rules for life. It's like a field manual, if you will, kind of like Sun Tzu's The Art of War or Machiavelli's The Prince. This is my philosophy, and one that has held me in good stead through 10 presidential campaigns and numerous other struggles in my life. It's available at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or you can go to stonesrules.com or on my website, stonecoldtruth.com, and get a copy. But I really think anyone can find this book useful. You don't have to be a Trump supporter. You don't have to be a Republican. I think this book kind of works for everybody, and it's, as you can see, got some very cool illustrations.
Yeah, that's definitely for sure. When you mentioned Sun Tzu, Art of War, I have to say that was sort of my winning book before that I was looked as a field manual. Definitely Stone's Rule is by far the more updated version and more applicable to pretty much everything like you said. So everybody out there, as you know, there's a lot of guests on the show, and clearly I get a whole lot of books, but there's only so many I could read. And obviously, this was one that I'd already known about. So when it finally came in, for this interview, I knew this was something I was going to read. And unfortunately, I didn't have much time because of how late it came into, but I was able to start it. But before I did that glance through it, I'm telling everybody out there, definitely read this and keep this book. It's not one of those that you read and sort of put away or maybe loan it to a friend. You want to kind of keep this as your how-to book for the rest of your life. Now, you mentioned stonecoldtruth.com. Any other websites and social media you want to plug in? I know you have a Minds account.
Well, stonecoldtruth.com is where I write about politics. Mm-hmm. Stonezone.com is where I post stories that are written about me. And then, of course, there's the Stone Defense Fund, because I've got to raise $2 million to stay out of jail. Robert Mueller has me in his crosshairs. He can't find any evidence of Russian collusion or WikiLeaks collaboration or evidence that I knew about John Podesta's Fakakta emails in advance. But he's not above conjuring up some bogus charge in order to silence me, because I'm a major critic of his investigation, and to stop my vocal support for the president. I really do face personal bankruptcy, and therefore people can go to stonedefensefund.com, stonedefensefund.com, if they want to help. Those are the key social media sites. Now, I'm on Facebook, Roger J. Stone Jr. Stone Cold Truth is also on Facebook, but Twitter, as you may know, I am banned for life.
Yep. James Wood?
Well, I'm banned until I lead a corps of 300 heavily armed men into the Twitter headquarters in California and take over. But until then, I'm banned for life.
By the way, you and unfortunately all the people I've had from InfoWars lately, I've been sort of banned from YouTube. Joel Scalzo, who was on last week, of course, they demonetized his video right away. Jerome Corsi, fortunately, Miss Katie Neely was able to fix that. Let's see how long it lasts. And I wouldn't be surprised, Mr. Stone, if they do the same thing to you. But that's okay, because when you're ready to take those 300 men, I'll be the 301st man to go in with you. Well, listen, we have come near the end of the show. Real quick, like I said, just hang on tight real quick afterwards. But if you have one final statement to all the listeners, and mind you, we are broadcasting in the U.S. and the U.K. on the internet and terrestrial radio, what would you say to your global audience right now?
Keep the faith. America is back under Donald Trump. We are not going to fold under this onslaught in which they are simply trying to undo the results of the last election. Bill Hill and Hillary Clinton are two of the most corrupt public figures in history. Hillary Clinton is a foul-mouthed, short-tempered, self-centered kleptocrat, a woman who is enormously abusive and enormously entitled. And I will not rest until she is in a federal penitentiary.
Well said, Mr. Stone, and I do hope you are able to join us, because I know this time I had to close the lines. A lot of people wanted to ask questions, but because of the limited time, I said if he comes back, then that will be everybody's opportunity. Stay tuned, folks. When we come back from break, Mr. or Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai, he says, the inventor of email, that is up for debate, but at least he is another shock candidate who keeps sending DNA tests to Elizabeth Warren, also known as Pocahontas, who, by the way, keeps sending them back. So take a listen to that interview, enjoy it, and he will be back before the election on November 9th to hopefully get that extra push to unseat Miss Pocahontas. Tomorrow, a very major a New York Times best-selling author, Whitley Strieber. I know many of listeners already know who he is. Same time, same place. Let me give my thanks to Late Night in the Midlands, Katie and Daryl Neely, for all their hard work behind the scenes at running the station as the managers, audio engineers, and so much more. Michael Vara for owning the network. And in the United Kingdom, we have Deep Program Radio Network and JC doing a fine job over there, bringing us into the European theater, and all you fine folks listening on terrestrial radio. I have to say, for now, since we do have a pre-recorded guest. The next hour, I'm Dr. J, and I am officially signing off.